Welcome to Nerds at Church, a podcast about nerdery and the Bible. I'm Pastor Kay, and I use pronouns like she and her.
And I'm Pastor Emily, and my pronouns are they, them, theirs.
And I am Pace, and my pronouns are none or they, them.
In this episode, we'll discuss Reformation Day, which falls on October 31st, which some people might know as Halloween. And just one content notification for this episode. During our deep dive, we do talk about Martin Luther and to a lesser extent, Dietrich Bonhoeffer's anti-Semitism. So be prepared for that.
Check out the episode description for links to the Bible passages and other references we make in this episode.
For our deep dive into Martin Luther and the Reformation, we have special guest Pace Warfield May, who is a chaotic lay and queer theologian and Luther scholar. They are working on a PhD from the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, California, and live in Washington, D.C. with their queer fam and dogs. Also, they co-host the podcast Horror Nerds at Church, the after-hours sibling podcast to Nerds at Church. Each week, they watch a horror film, then talk about what that film can teach us about God, the Bible, and each other. And I think it's just, brilliant to have you on now because we had you and your co-host Joe on for our Easter 3 episode, where you two and we all discussed if Jesus was a zombie. And so then it makes sense to have you back on for Halloween, which happens to also be Reformation Day, which I just made that connection.
Love it.
I knew that they were the same day, but the connection with Horror Nerds at Church. And this year, Reformation Day is on an actual Sunday, so that's partly why we're extra special excited. It's also the first Reformation Day that we have of this iteration of our podcast. So so much excitement to have you on, Pace. And to kind of get us started, I know a lot of our listeners are familiar with Reformation, but not all of them. So can you just give us a brief kind of summary of what was the Reformation? Specifically, the Protestant Reformation is what we talk about when we, on this podcast, talk about the Reformation.
Sure, yeah. So the real quick version is basically in the late medieval, early modern period. The Roman Catholic Church at the time was pretty much the only Christian denomination in most of Western and Central Europe. Of course, there was the Orthodox Christian kind of branch of Christianity more in Eastern Europe and parts of the Mediterranean. But the Catholic Church started this practice called the indulgences, where basically what people could do is purchase a slip of paper which basically guaranteed that either them or a family member that they purchased it on behalf of would receive some sort of forgiveness or years off of their time in purgatory. And a lot of those indulgences really took up steam with the building of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. So if you've ever been there, gorgeous church. You can imagine how much money it took to construct that, especially using late medieval, early modern construction methods. So a very expensive undertaking. So the indulgences was a way to help kind of build up sale for this basilica. It came to the attention of a German monk named Martin Luther. He was an Augustinian monk, and he thought that the sale of indulgences was absolutely immoral and wrong. He went against the teachings of the Bible about the grace of Jesus Christ. So he published the 95 Theses, Theses, not feces. It's hard to hear sometimes on audio recordings. But the 95 Theses, he published basically 95 arguments about a variety of things, but primarily the gist of it was primarily against the sale of indulgences. He mailed a copy of it on October 31st, and also, according to legend, he nailed a copy of that to the door of the St. Mary's Church in Wittenberg, which is basically the public bulletin board, as a way to kind of prompt debate and discussion about it. That event happened October 31st, 1517, and that basically prompted the beginnings of what would become the Protestant Reformation. He was kind of stepping into a crap show he did not realize he was stepping into, because there's all sorts of political stuff going on, which I don't have time to get into in this deep dive. But essentially, he unknowingly thought he was just like innocently starting a debate about this practice of the sale of indulgences, but there's a whole bunch of political stuff with princes and stuff using indulgences to help pay off some of their debts. And it started this kind of flame war between him and certain members of the Catholic Church that escalated till he eventually was excommunicated. And that was kind of the start of the Lutheran Church. He did not call it the Lutheran Church. He called it, at the time, it was the Evangelical Church, and it's still called in Germany the Evangelical Church of Germany. But yeah, essentially, that's what kickstarted the Protestant Reformation, and it kind of evolved from there with other reformers, many who we don't learn about in seminary, which I wish we had time to get into. But people, well, John Calvin, of course, is the other big one people think of, but there's all sorts of women reformers like Argela von Grumbach and Margaret de Navarre and these great reformers that were also part of this time, and really like this explosion of new thinking about the gospel. This kind of, the Renaissance was happening at the same time, so it's this time of like going back to the sources of the Bible, investigating the Greek and Hebrew text of the Bible, as opposed to just relying on the Latin Vulgate, to kind of get this ad fontes, back to the sources kind of approach to scripture, and kind of this evolution of the supremacy of scripture over the doctrines of the church. And yeah, I can keep going on about it, but I think that's probably enough. So I'll stop there.
Of the stuff you just said, I have two quick questions. One, several of our listeners may not be familiar with the word evangelical outside of the recent American context, which gives it a very different understanding. Could you tell us a little bit about what the word evangelical meant to the, now understood as Lutherans of the 1500s?
Sure. It comes from the Greek evangelos, I believe. I'm not
Close
Greek
enough.
scholar, so
Evangelion.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah, so something like that. But basically meaning like good news. It was this, Luther and his fellow reformers are really trying to say that we are kind of uncovering this good news, this gospel that the bureaucracy of the church and political side of the church up to that point has, at least they felt, kind of hidden or obscured from the average person. And so part of this was like sharing this by translating the Bible into German. That was one of Luther's big projects in the early 1520s, was translating the Bible into German so it's accessible to the average person. So that's kind of like what they thought of as evangelical, was this, we're spreading the good news, we are sharing, we're going back to like this gospel of Jesus and trying to get that to the average person.
I like the particular piece of like making it accessible, right? The changing it into German was changing it into what's also the fancy term is, right, vernacular. Yes. What the language of the people, and even if not everybody could read, to be reading it aloud even in German helped people to be able to hear it and understand it, and so like removing the barriers to access it, which we just recently a couple weeks ago had Pastor Beth Wartick on and talked about disability and consent and accessibility. And so we've done a couple episodes on accessibility, but this like continues that, right? The part of the Reformation was, how do you make the good news more accessible to people?
And then my second question from your introduction to the Reformation in 30 seconds pace is that if the Lutheran Church was founded on Halloween, does that mean that the Lutherans are the spookiest?
I hope so. I really do.
Just not in a Get Out kind of way.
No, good
Yeah,
spooky.
we're the most spirited. Well, yes, good spooky, unless we are talking about the ELCA, the largest white denomination.
The whitest denomination
The
in
whitest
the country.
denomination, yes, in the United States, which is kind of that
Slightly
Get Out
different
sort
kind
of
of
Jordan
spooky,
Peele.
yes. But
Yes,
on the whole, we're
for
like
real.
aiming for hocus pocus kind of spooky, we would hope. Yeah.
Yes.
I hope so. We're the most spirited. How about that?
There you go. Which, if you haven't already checked it out, you should definitely check out. Horror Nerds at Church does lots of horror movies, and horror movies are not my jam. But they also, but they also do a couple non-horror movies that are kind of in the genre each season. And we were guest episodes on the episode that came out October 7th on Hocus Pocus. So you should definitely check out that if you want some of that kind of spookiness. But I was also going to say, for folks who are interested in kind of brief bios or brief, like, here are some other reformers who you might not have learned about or heard about, we'll link in the episode description to a blog post that I did a few years ago, I think in 2017, so on the 500th anniversary, that actually links intentionally to, that has like short bios for a variety of reformers who I didn't learn about in seminary and had to learn about elsewhere.
Yeah. One of my favorite things I developed a class called Queering the Reformation, and Emily actually took a version of that class. But one of the things that I really wanted to do in that class was to do the B-side tracks, is what I called it, of the reformers. So we looked at Luther, we looked at Calvin, but my hope was to do some of the works that are not as read of them. But then I also wanted to include a large sample of works from people that are not Calvin and are not Luther, and give them some time in the sun. So Marie Dentier is another one of those reformers who was a Calvinist. I can't think of her name, but there's this one Renaissance woman who I love. Yes, Olympia Fulva-Murata, one of those.
There we go. Yeah.
But she's a fantastic kind of Renaissance woman and poet, and so many people out there. So definitely check out Emily's posts. Because even for those of us who went to seminary, or those of us who have studied the Reformation, there's so much that just is not talked about enough. One of my professors, Kirsty Sierna, she's my advisor for my dissertation. She wrote this book called Women of the Reformation. And I went to a lecture that she was presenting on that book, and she was talking about how in her research for the book, she went to this library I think it was in Wittenberg, trying to track down this original German language pamphlet of something that I think it was Argula von Grumbach had written, this pamphlet. And so she was trying to track it down, and she kept requesting it, and they kept giving her this giant volume of the works of the reformers that was published in like 1530 or something. And she's like, I don't want this, I want Argula's work. And then she finally looked at it more closely at the table of contents, and Argula was listed right in there as these other reformers. So it's like in the time, in the 1530s when this volume was published, or 1540s, whenever it was, she was seen as a reformer, but somehow that has been lost to history, and Luther and Calvin have really taken the spotlight, which just is not accurate to what reality is, sadly.
Yeah, that also reminds me of the conversation that's been happening that I didn't know this, but so we recently celebrated Indigenous Peoples Day, and part of that has been telling the truth about Christopher Columbus and the harm that he caused. And then there's always this, like, whenever it comes to like racism, there's this like, oh, but we have to judge people based on like the time period they were in. And actually, if you do that to Christopher Columbus, he was actually like condemned and ostracized for how horrible he was by his people. So like even in his time, he was like judged in that way. And so I think it's interesting the ways that we erase, like, I mean, there are systemic reasons why we erase Argula von Grumbach and others from the Reformation. There are systemic reasons why we don't pay attention to how other people reacted to Christopher Columbus's harm. But
for real.
I do have a question. So do you know, I mean, the assumption is always that like Martin Luther posted the 95 Theses the day before All Saints Day because, like, on purpose? But is it that like that was a big day that lots of people would be there to have a discussion? Or do you know, like, I don't know, I guess I always assumed it was because lots of people would see it then?
That's a good question. Like, first of all, whether or not he posted it on the door of the Chapel of Wittenberg is kind of up for debate. Right. There doesn't seem to be reason to believe that he didn't. It was kind of at the time to post a lot of notices and stuff on the church, on the doors of the church, as kind of like a community bulletin board. But wrote a letter and enclosed the theses with it to Albert of Brandenburg, and who was the Archbishop of Mainz, on October 31st, 1517, which is also where that date comes from. So we don't actually know if he posted the theses on the door on the 31st or not, but that's kind of when the date he put on the letter. And one of the churches in Wittenberg was the All Saints Church. So, I mean, was it intentional to post it on the eve of All Saints on the Church of All Saints, perhaps. So there could be intention there. I'm not sure exactly what that was, if that was intentional or just accident
or wordplay.
Gotcha.
Or wordplay. Yeah, I mean, maybe he was a 5. I don't think Luther was a 5, but
no, I don't think he was a 5 either. That seems not.
It was something he wanted to discuss with all the saints.
Yeah, for real.
Yeah. Well, and okay, so just a quick anecdote. The sale of indulgences we've established is not a good thing, but a bake sale of indulgences as a fundraiser for local queer organizations, which is what House for All Sinners and Saints in Denver, Colorado has done for several years. I think they're still doing it, except it's a pandemic, so I don't actually know. But on Reformation Day, they have a bake sale of indulgences, which I think is fantastic. And if anybody ever wants to participate in that with me in our own capacity, apart from House for All Sinners and Saints, I am so down for that.
Also, I don't think that they're saying that the baked goods involved convey grace.
I mean, except that they have grace. I mean, they do they convey grace, but they don't get you out of purgatory, because we don't believe in purgatory.
I mean, if you use them for communion, they would certainly convey grace in that sense, like those baked goods.
But because you use them for communion and not because they were sold at that particular bake sale of indulgence. Yeah.
True.
Correct. Yes.
Oh, goodness. Well, we may have discovered a new kind of heresy. That was exciting.
This is the time for it.
Right?
If we're going to come up with new heresies, it might as well be on Reformation Day.
So some theologians are systematic theologians, which just means that they try to cover everything by what they write, which I personally usually find a little irritating, because that just means that they're giving themselves an excuse to go on for as long as they want, and they really like the sound of their own voices. Not that I'm talking about anyone in particular, Calvin. But others, like Luther and also Jesus, handily enough, are more practical and just seem to talk about what stuff as it comes up in their lives. Like, for example, we know what Luther thought about Christian behavior during plagues because he lived through one. So is there anything that Luther didn't write on that you, Pace, would especially like to hear from him on?
But also, spoilers, Martin Luther thought that we should all do our best to keep each other safe during a plague, and if you could isolate, and if you couldn't, do your best to provide safety and protection. So in a contemporary sense, Martin Luther would have been of the wear your mask and get the vaccine camp.
Yeah, there's this, just as a quick aside, there's this kind of contemporary strain of thinking about Luther that kind of sees him as this proto freedom fighter for personal rights and individual freedoms, and that really wasn't. No. That's really a mischaracterization of Luther. He was very, very much concerned about caring for a neighbor, and especially caring for the poor, and was kind of even suggested this what he called a community bank or a community chest, which would be basically this early form of socialism of let's tax people, put the money in there, and then use it to help the poor, and also fund things like public education and stuff like that. So so Luther is clearly not in the anti-mask camp. If he were alive today, I can almost guarantee it.
Yeah. And I loved Freedom of a Christian. I had to read that when I was in undergrad, and that was one of my favorite things, because it talks about the freedom of a Christian, but also the way that we are in service to each other and to the good of the whole community.
Exactly. The freedom of Christian, the famous line of that is, a Christian is free and Lord of all things, but the Christian is free to be a servant to all and to serve others. So it's this kind of paradox or twist where it's you are free, but what are you free for? You're free to serve others, which is not the party line of the anti-mask movement and today. But yeah, that's a great question, Kay, about what I wish Luther would have written on. I'm not really sure I can think of anything. First of all, just for listeners out there, Luther wrote a whole heck of a lot.
He did.
The most common English translation of Luther's works, the original is called the American edition. It's 55 volumes, and then Concordia Publishing House is publishing another 25 or something. So that's just I can show you all my bookshelf, which has the original 55 is like right over there. Is like 3 shelves worth of Luther's books. But the original German, Luther was really a fluent, trilingually fluent in Latin, German, and Greek, and then he knew a little bit of Hebrew, and he wrote like many of his stuff he would write and then translate himself into both German and Latin, because Latin was the scholarly language and German was the vernacular of the people. So he tried to do a lot in both. And so the original language texts of Luther's works that are 150 volumes, somewhere in that camp, like this huge volumes of Luther's works. He like basically bled ink. Like he just was always, I guess when you're in the late medieval era, like what else are you gonna do? You're not gonna watch TV, you're just gonna write, I guess.
Alexander Hamilton wishes he wrote that much.
Right. So
and throw
much
ink at the wall.
Yes, at the devil / wall. But yeah, so I'm not sure what I wish he would have covered. There are some things I wish he wouldn't have covered, because his 16th century mindset, just, living of those times, you don't understand the complexities that things like science, social sciences, and the biological sciences have brought up about gender and about human sexuality and stuff. So some of his stuff is a little bit like, I kind of wish you hadn't tackled that. But
yeah,
I don't know. That's a great question. I have to think on that.
Yeah. And speaking of the things we wish he hadn't written, what is some of the stuff that we tend to avoid when we talk about Martin Luther? The stuff that we don't talk about that he did or wrote or said, or who he was?
Yeah, first of all, there's a lot of misunderstanding about Luther, even among people even like what is taught in seminaries, I find. So first, Luther I don't think would have described himself as a theologian. He was a Hebrew Bible scholar more than anything else. Most of his works were written on the Bible. He did a lot of commentary on the Bible. He did a lot of lecturing because he was a university professor, so he taught in the Bible. Most of his teaching was Hebrew Bible stuff.
Which is ironic, because he didn't, of the biblical languages, Hebrew is the one he knew least.
Yeah, I was going to say. That was...
Melanchthon was more of I believe Melanchthon was more of the Hebrew scholar. It might be confusing. Maybe Melanchthon was more of the Greek. But I do know that he had a good community to help him with
the actual translation stuff.
And I don't think it would have been that unusual for him to be primarily working with the Septuagint, which was the Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures, right? So
yeah, correct. When he taught his Genesis lectures, he taught them over 10 years, first of all, which talk about an undertaking. But what would happen is the students would get, because this was in the era of the printing press, they were able to actually print the Latin Vulgate with enough space that people could write notes on. And so Luther basically go through the text and give his commentary, give his lecture on it, and people would kind of take notes around the text of it. So he was doing a lot of teaching out of the Vulgate, simply because that was kind of like the NRSV today. It's like what the standard is that most people use, even if it's not particularly the best translation. So that was just kind of how that worked. But yeah, so Hebrew Bible scholar more than anything else. He did the Genesis lectures over 10 years. He did at least 2 sets of lectures on the Psalms. He also did some stuff on like Romans and all that, but his true passion, I think, was the Hebrew Bible.
Yeah, that's a thing that I think the most common thing I heard about Luther and Luther's scholarship is Romans, as far as biblical scholarship, because that's what Lutherans hold so tightly to, of this is what Lutheran theology is so rooted in. But so that's fascinating that actually Hebrew Bible is more his jam, and particularly the Genesis lectures.
Yeah, and the Psalms. Like he said, the entirety of Scripture, the law, the gospel, everything was contained in the book of Psalms. And so that, I think Psalms were his favorite book of the Bible, even more so than things like Romans and stuff.
His least favorites, of course, being James and Jude, which he didn't think needed to be in the Bible at all.
And Revelation, kind of put into little apocrypha at the end of his New Testament. But another thing people don't quite understand, I think nowadays most people understand or know that Luther wrote a fair amount of anti-Semitic texts towards the end of his life. I think that's kind of more public knowledge now. It didn't used to be. Perhaps the most infamous of them is On the Jews and Their Lies, where he talks about like how people should basically go around, trash synagogues, burn them down and stuff. He was not at all advocating for harming people, but definitely saying we need to, that towards the end of his life he took a stance of like the Jewish religious culture needs to be stopped, and how do we do that? And that of course was used in some of the Nazi propaganda during the Third Reich and stuff, and was kind of part of the propaganda of the propaganda machine of the Third Reich, and contribute to the Holocaust and all those things, because he kind of is a folk hero in Germany, more so than just a religious figure, similar to how like George Washington or Abraham Lincoln might be here in the States. So it's like, if you want to get a point across, you might want to reach back to a quote from George Washington. And so you can see how that could easily be used for propaganda at that time. Yeah. But a lot of people just think it's like this end of life cranky Luther thing. But really, unfortunately, it's this central part of his exegesis from beginning to end. He, like I said, he did a lot of work in the Hebrew Bible. So he was very much this supersessionist in his understanding of the Hebrew Bible. He believed that the best way to interpret the Hebrew Bible is through this Christological lens, through the lens of the gospel, as he described it. So from the beginning, he always had this very kind of patronizing look towards the Jewish religion and towards Jewish practitioners. And it just kind of continued to evolve in his life to the point where it became like this outright hostility towards the end of his life. So that's one thing I think a lot of people don't quite understand, and are kind of, especially like ELCA Lutherans, are like scared to kind of really engage with Luther there. But there's this book I want to recommend called Martin Luther, The Bible and the Jewish People by Brooks Schramm and Kirsi Sierna, which really kind of tackles a lot of this. And there's this quote in here that I'll just quick read. It says, contemporary Lutheran Christians, and indeed any Christian who has been positively affected by Luther's courageous articulation of the gospel, have a moral obligation to reckon with how Luther sounded and sounds to Jewish ears. And like, that's kind of the thesis of this book, is like, how can we, in this interreligious era that we're in, like, how can we reckon with this founder of our faith who is very kind of, was very lifelong anti-Semitic, and yet in his writings, he still defended Jewish people in his early writings and stuff. But yet it was always this kind of like, now that we have rescued the gospel from the Catholic Church, it's only a matter of time before Jews see the light and come to Christianity, was kind of like always his thinking. And when that didn't happen towards the end of his life, he became just more openly hostile towards them. So that's the really bad part of his legacy. There's some other aspects of his legacy we don't like to talk about, like his stance on the peasants revolt in Germany. He kind of tried to play both sides at first, and then he ended up kind of coming down against the peasants towards the, but by that point the war had already been won. So like before, like, so like he was just kind of hesitant to step in, and then when he was kind of pressured to step in, he basically waited till it was won and then said, okay, yeah, the winners are right. So not a great look, but that's part of it. I mean, it's something we shouldn't be so scared of, because I mean, this is the same type of thing we need to do with Jesus. When Jesus calls a woman, you know, basically a or whatever, in that passage where she about feeding the table scraps to dogs, or Paul and all of his, much of his writing, which kind of veers into this anti-sexist stuff. Like Paul has this vision of the kingdom of heaven being this really like egalitarian thing, but he's still so like mired in his time and his own biases, he can't fully live into that. And I really think that's the case with Luther too. He has this beautiful, amazing, liberating understanding of the gospel as this freeing agent of Christ, and yet he's not able to even to apply that to the marginalized people of his time and get past his own biases. So, and for me as a Luther scholar, this is one of the things that I love Luther. I love his works. And so kind of is this thing that we do out of love, is to hold people accountable, hold who we love accountable to their harmful actions. And if we don't if we do anything less than that, then we are not, then it's not real love, and it's not real engagement with the person that we are working with.
Yeah, so we touch on what you're talking about, Pace, in our episode on the 15th Sunday after Pentecost, where we talk about biblical cussing, but that's comes out of the conversation because the gospel is the Syrophoenician woman in Mark. And then the 16th Sunday after Pentecost is teaching and learning difficult things. So the time where we hold people accountable precisely because we care for them, not in spite of it or because we don't care for them.
Yeah, and that's a really important concept. And for some reason, there seems to be a lot of struggle with that, especially among, I think pastors don't like to get into this with their congregations. But I'm like, really, this is the stuff we need to be talking about. Like, we can't just have this. Recently, 2017 was the 500th anniversary of the 95 Theses. So a lot of churches had celebrations of the 500th anniversary of the Reformation, but the ELCA itself called it a commemoration, not a celebration, because of the mixed legacy Luther has. And I think that's important. Like, we need to be able to contextualize it, or else we're not being kind to the people who are still harmed by his writings today, and also not being true to the legacy it has.
And we're not empowering, like you said, right? When pastors in particular and church leaders are not having those conversations with congregations, we're not empowering congregations to be able to read what Martin Luther says with open hearts and with clarity. And that's one of the things that, like, we try and do on Nerds at Church, is to make these conversations accessible specifically to lay people, because they're the majority of the church.
Yeah.
Right? Like, they're the ones who are the majority. They need to know. Like,
yeah.
It makes no sense not to have these conversations and not to be sharing it. Otherwise, we're not going to make progress and we're not going to do better.
Which is a very Lutheran concept, which is so strange to me that the Lutheran Church doesn't fully embrace it. Like, Luther is like, I'm going to write a small catechism to be used in every household. I'm going to create a community chest and to argue for public education so lay people can learn how to read and engage with scripture and other texts. I'm going to translate the Bible into the vernacular. And then it's like, now fast forward 500 plus years, and it's like, oh, lay people can't possibly learn about real biblical scholarship. How could we tell them that?
And the small catechism turned into something that we used to memorize for confirmation, but now it's too hard.
Oh God, yeah. Exactly.
I never memorized it.
I didn't.
And I
was
don't
the,
think you
well,
have
no,
to memorize
I was the generation after that. I was the generation that was grateful we didn't have to.
Yeah, but like exploring it and like asking the questions, what does this mean? Like, you don't have to take Luther's answer for what it means, but asking the questions is so good. Yeah.
There's one other aspect that is, we don't tend to talk about Luther. Kind of a positive aspect, I think, of his life is that Luther was really this kind of a mystic at heart. He really had this kind of mystical relationship with the Bible, and he had this really deep and intense prayer life. And so the Finnish scholar Tuomo Mannerma in the late 70s wrote this book. I think it's called Christ Present in Faith. And it is essential, and now it's translated into English, a really short book, so anyone can basically pick it up and read it. But basically, he finds in Luther's Galatians lectures that Luther had this really deep understanding of what we call the happy exchange. This is going to be going too deep into the rabbit hole, but essentially the end result is that through God's grace and through our faith in Jesus, we become truly united with Christ in this kind of mystical union, which is really this kind of medieval mystic concept that Luther fully embraced. And yet we never talk about that. We focus more on this forensic understanding of justification, which is this, we shy away from things like the third use of the law and works righteousness and all this stuff. But it's like, for Luther, that was still a central part of his understanding. We don't need works to get into heaven, but sanctification is kind of this outpouring of the faith that unites us with Christ. So it's like we become fully united with God. And that's something that only recently has been getting some scholarly attention, and I don't think it's really trickled down to laity at all. And it's such a shame, because it is it's really one of the more beautiful aspects of Luther's theology that is kind of, I guess, when I first discovered it, is what made me fall in love with Luther and want to become a Luther scholar.
Sure.
So we've talked about some of the like stuff that we don't talk about Martin Luther, but what about the Reformation? What's some of the stuff that we tend to avoid talking about connected to the Reformation?
Oof. Okay, so the Reformation, how it is typically framed in Protestant circles, is Reformation was all good. All these like nuns were freed from their convents and and had to escape in fish barrels like Katie Luther and stuff. And like all of a sudden everybody was happy because now they had the Bible in their home and in their language and stuff.
Yeah, minus the like death threats and attempts to take Martin Luther's life, but like the rest of it, you know, joyous and great.
And it was just like truly well received by the average person. Like it's just, we really paint this fairy tale picture of the Reformation, which is just not at all true. The Reformation really had some mixed effects on different demographics, especially on queer folk and especially on women. You are a woman and you want to get educated during the late medieval time. Unless you're a nobility, you would probably go to a convent where you would learn to read and write. Now you're not allowed to go to convents anymore and you're expected to get married and have babies. Like that is the family. This is kind of the origin of this like Protestant family model and sexual ethic kind of coming out of this, which we're still struggling with in mainline Protestants today, about like, especially when it comes to queer people, you know, like this, the only right way to be in sexual relationship is through marriage and with the intention of children and stuff, which is this real bad legacy that the Reformation has left.
Especially since during the Reformation, getting married and having a kid was a serious risk to your health and life. Like dying in childbirth was a leading cause of death.
Yeah. So like taking away that avenue to independence and to self-determination was not necessarily
a lot of people died.
And like you're saying, a lot of people died also because of some of the wars that broke out from different territories and stuff, debating whether they wanted to become Protestant, or like if you're a layperson, you didn't really have a choice if you're Protestant or Catholic. It was whatever the prince or regional director of your territory decided your territory would be. And so it's like we talk about this like freedom of religious choice, but that did not exist in the Reformation either. That wasn't
existed for like until the princes, and then they fought about it.
Exactly. And then I presented a paper at a history conference a while ago about this. So I'll just touch on this briefly. But for queer folk, you know, we've always existed, and we existed in the Reformation times too. Monastic communities tended to be where a lot of queer folk went, because you were able to be with people of the same gender. Even if it wasn't a sexual relationship, you could form close bonds. But of course, we know that there probably was some kind of sexual intercourse happening at these convents and monasteries, but not necessarily exclusively so. Like also these queer platonic friendships and these chosen families that were really closely knit together, and avenues to kind of live this life of education and reading and contemplative life among this chosen family is now taken away and stripped and from you. And so the only choices that's left is like this kind of conventional family model. And the other issue too is that Luther and Calvin both used a lot of rhetoric around sodomy, and especially flinging it towards the Catholic Church. So you have like queer people getting caught in that crossfire of like, the Pope is a sodomite. It's like, well, if it's being presented in this bad way, then that's, you know, that's not good. And so in a recent Horror Nerds at Church episode, we did it on The film The Witch 2015 film. We talked about kind of the evolution of witchcraft in as this kind of scapegoat, and that happened in the Reformation. The witch trials started in the Reformation, and the increase of trials around sodomy started during the Reformation, because we were scapegoating queer people, queer men as sodomites, and queer women and people who didn't conform to genders as witches, and as a way to kind of keep the peace between Protestants and Catholics by focusing on this other outside force that was kind of breaking down the morality of the surrounding area. So it's like, so there's really these harmful kind of gross consequences of the Reformation that we just never ever talk about.
And I mean, when it comes to Martin Luther's insults, it is like potentially on par with Shakespeare, right? Like Martin Luther
Yeah.
could insult people. And actually, I have a friend from seminary, and we'll link in the episode description, who created a Martin Luther insulter, which is in the vein of the Shakespearean insulter. And like there is a disclaimer that like this is contextual, and so like there are anti-Semitic insults, there are queerphobic insults, because as you mentioned, like that is part of how Martin Luther was insulting the Pope and others in power.
Yeah.
And I think
but he was also super creative. I mean, he came up with plenty of other ways to insult people.
No, he was definitely creative. And I think his means punched down, right? Like calling someone a sodomite as a negative thing was punching down, but in his who he was trying to insult, I think most of the time, if not all the time, aside from like when he started to explicitly go after Jewish people, he was punching up, right? He was punching up at the Pope. He was punching up at the higher ups who were like using the sale of indulgences for their own means and all of that stuff. So like he didn't do it perfectly, but he was trying to punch up with that, which I think, I mean, it doesn't make it better, but makes it different.
Even today, it's not as prominent today, but there's still a lot of pockets in especially North American Protestantism that's very anti-Catholic because of this. A lot of it kind of stems from Luther. And I think a lot of people forget, you know, when Luther was writing this stuff, he wasn't writing it as a Lutheran against Catholics. He was writing it as a Catholic against his own denomination, against the people in charge who were not listening to him and who were hurting the people around him. So it's like if I wrote this treatise against against our Bishop Elizabeth like today, and then 500 years from now they're like, oh, we hate Lutherans because look at what Pace wrote against the bishop again because of, I don't know, bound consciousness or something. It's like that doesn't translate the same as me as a person who was raised Lutheran, who went through a Lutheran seminary and went through the Lutheran candidacy process, arguing against some of the unjust practices of the Lutheran Church today, which is what Luther is doing against the Catholic Church as somebody who was part of the only church that existed at the time in his area.
Yeah, much like Jesus talking about the Jews and the Gospels written by Jewish people to largely Jewish people.
Right, that like both Jesus and Paul were Jewish their whole life.
Yeah.
Yeah. And therefore, we need to take the comments about the Jews in the New Testament in that context.
Yeah, for real.
So, Pace, since your dissertation is on Luther, and that's one of the reasons we, invited you here today to be our special guest, can you tell us a little bit about your dissertation and what you're up to?
Sure. I'll try to keep it brief. One of the untaught skills that you need to learn as a PhD student is the elevator pitch of your dissertation. Yes. But my dissertation is on Luther's Genesis lectures that I've already mentioned. He lectured on Genesis from 1535 till 1545, almost till the end of his life, because he died in 1546. And especially in the first two chapters of Genesis in the Bible, as you know, it's very much concerned about the creation of the world, of the universe, and of people. And so Luther really delves deep into this kind of theological anthropology there, and what it means to be human, what it means to be human in relationship to each other, to be these beings that are created to be sexual, these beings that are given gender. And it's this really interesting thing because Luther is so like distinct in his thinking from anybody else at the time in this theological anthropology, that even though he's writing in the 16th century, and even though it's still this very binary sense of gender and this kind of complementarian sense of gender, Luther still leaves so much wiggle room there to really dive in and kind of queer things up a little bit and shake things up. So that's essentially what I'm doing, is trying to create a queer theological anthropology out of Luther's Genesis lectures, and kind of as a response to the Lutheran Church today, which still really struggles with the concept of people who exist outside of a gender binary and people who love in ways that are different than these cis heterosexual marriage relationships and familiar relationships. And I'm trying to show like, well, that's not really Luther either. Luther was much more ambiguous than that. And there's a lot of room for creativity there. So that's pretty much the gist of what I'm working on.
That's, just a small endeavor. Nothing
Yep.
giant
Just a small
or
thing.
reformative or church shattering.
We'll see. If I ever finish this damn thing. That's the important thing.
I have faith in you, Pace. And also, academics does not, in fact, convey your worth as a human being.
Absolutely.
That comes from God. Woo!
Yay. It's almost like you're Lutheran or something saying that.
I know! Weird.
And thank God for that. Our first reading for this episode is from Jeremiah chapter 31, verses 31 through 34. Jeremiah shares that God will make a new covenant with God's people that will be written on their hearts and grounded in forgiveness.
So, one of the themes in this passage is the idea of covenant or commitment, mutual commitments. And as I was thinking about this, it reminded me of voter registration. So, I just moved to Baltimore and we don't have an election coming up, but Iowa does do off-year elections, which actually, it's not a good thing. And you should always try and change it so that it's during a national election because more people participate that way. But it reminded me of voter registration, right? This idea of when people are canvassing for candidate or something like that, that you're trying to register people to vote, but you're also trying to get their commitment to vote. So it's this mutual how do you have the conversations and set up the agreement that yes, I'm planning to vote, and I'm planning to vote for your person, and the commitment of all of the volunteers to that person to do the thing. And there's this delightful young adult kind of romance novel called Yes, No, Maybe So. It follows two characters. One is a Muslim girl and one is a Jewish boy. And it takes place mostly during Ramadan. And it's them who, they used to be friends when they were kids and then they lost touch. And now it's they're reconnecting because they're canvassing for this guy in this particular, mostly suburban district of Atlanta in Georgia. And so it's this, their commitment and her commitment of, during Ramadan doing this, but, also their commitment together of doing this. And then, so it's, multi-level commitmenting, but it was just this beautiful example where I was oh, I had never thought about our commitment as people who live in a democracy to voting and to encouraging others to vote and to helping others and supporting others to vote, and then holding the people we elect accountable for their actions.
I'm not actually sure I agree with Emily on the point of only ever having elections in years where there's national elections, but we can move on from that. Because I have ADHD and keeping track of what year those elections happen is a little harder for me than just every first Tuesday in November. Okay,
well,
time to vote. But
the brilliant part, though, is that you don't have to keep track. Presumably, the state will inform you that there's an election coming up.
See, I'm from Illinois. I don't expect the state to, be competent.
Yeah,
so...
but you live in Minnesota, and it's at least a little bit more This is ideal democracy. You're more likely.
We don't live in an ideal
have,
world, and I'm Lutheran, so I can.
I know, but we can work towards it.
This is not what this episode is about.
As we start the flame wars over.
This is gonna be it. Details. I'm a 5. It's about whatever we're arguing about.
I don't believe in the Enneagram, but whatever. Verse 31, we read, "The days are surely coming, says the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah." And the word covenant isn't a word that we use a lot in the modern world these days, so I thought I'd bring that up. A covenant is sort of a two-way promise. It's different from your usual promise because normally a promise is just something that one person makes to another or one group makes to another, but a covenant goes both ways. And that made me think of when the dead men of Dunharrow agree to help Aragorn fight Sauron's armies in The Lord of the Rings, which happens both in the book and the movie. And Aragorn agreed in exchange as a covenant, as a two-way promise, to free them from their eternal prison. So that is one example of a covenant in literature.
Yeah, and it's an example of a new covenant because they had broken the old covenant when they had committed to fight and then didn't. So
yeah,
that's extra. Yeah, I was reading this and when we came to verse 33, it says, "But this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, says the becoming one. I will put my law within them, and I will write it on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. And it reminded me of in the book Hero by Perry Moore. There are a few books called Hero, but Hero is a young adult novel by Perry Moore. Tom, who's the main character, and the others that he kind of gets in a group with, have to sign up, and they commit to being a people together. They're all people with different powers, so they commit to being a superhero group of people together and serving the city in the league that is like the superhero group that protects the city. It's a really cute book if you've never read it. It's a queer young adult book, but that is like they have a law that is written that is like within them as a community, and then they become the people of the city, and the city becomes their people to protect as well.
Yeah. And this gets to bring it back to the Luther thing, this gets to the more mystical side of Luther and what we call in theology the third use, where the first use of the law is a civil use that's meant for the good order of society. The second use of the law is to show us that we fail and cannot live up to God's law for us. So we are, it's a theological use. So we basically need God's grace to free us. But then the third use is this kind of hotly debated thing in some Protestant circles among the nerdy theologians who care about such things. And it basically is that the law is essentially written on the heart, so that and it's kind of sanctifying use. So the law allows us to then live into it after through our faith, and the accessing God's grace allows us to live into the third use of law. And so this is a very third use passage, which is funny to me because a lot of people don't think Luther was the third use person, and yet this is the text that they chose for Reformation Sunday. And I think he was, just personally, but like he never explicitly said it, but I think it's kind of clear in his thinking that he was more third use than not.
Sure. Interesting. This episode, we are covering Psalm 46, which is the psalm assigned for today. We don't usually cover psalms, except that Psalm 46 is the basis for Martin Luther's "A Mighty Fortress is Our God," which many, 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 too many Lutherans will sing on Reformation Day. And so...
Can there ever be too many Lutherans singing Mighty Fortress on Reformation Day?
I mean...
Like, really? We will also sing other things. So
it's true. But so we wanted to cover it. Every once in a while we tackle a psalm because it's well known or really poignant or very appropriate. So in Psalm 46, the psalmist praises God's strength and protection, proclaiming that God destroys war. So one of the themes in this psalm is the idea of tumult, right? If God is the mighty fortress, then the outside is this tumultuous place. And particularly, like, there's a reference to tumultuous water and seas and mountains. And so I was thinking about tumult, and that happens in the Sky Beyond the Storm, the final book of the Ember in the Ashes series, which our listeners have not heard me reference in a while, but know that I love. But in that, and this is spoilers, that book just came out in December, so it's relatively new, so spoilers. But in that book, there's this sea of suffering that has been building and growing more and more tumultuous over time as, like, all of these people are being killed and tortured, and the sea of suffering actually ends up spilling out over everything after Laia kills the Nightbringer, who has been causing all this suffering, but also who has experienced so much suffering, and the only way for the sea of suffering to, like, breach the barriers is for the Nightbringer to die. And so Laia, unknowingly, in trying to stop the Nightbringer, she intentionally kills him to try and stop him, but unknowingly then unleashes the sea of suffering and all of this tumult and sorrow and suffering on everyone in their whole world. Cool. Tumult. Scary stuff.
I find that interesting because there's this kind of queer understanding of, as you're talking about that, it kind of unlocked this kind of Marcella Althaus Reid sense of this queer understanding of tumult and where is God within that. And so, like, she talks specifically about how in the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, which for a long time and even today, many people think about it as this, like, God acting against queer people, because it was like that's even where the term sodomy comes from that we were talking about earlier. And so Marcella Althaus Reid envisions God present at the gates of Sodom as it was destroyed, being destroyed by this kind of cis hetero God is destroying the queer God in that moment. And so that there's this presence of God in this mighty fortress, to use Luther's language. And of course, people dwell there and are happy to dwell there with God in this kind of peaceful era. But God is also very much present in the queer wilderness beyond the fortress, and is existing within that. And it's really this kind of like queer frontier kind of space when we picture this. Jerusalem's this shining beacon on this hill, but just because God is present there does not mean that God is not also present and queering and being among and with, and even perhaps causing the tumult in the rest of the world.
Yeah. And a reminder that just like we've talked about this before, but the whole story of Sodom and Gomorrah has a whole lot more to do with economics and hospitality than it does any sort of like particularly queer band. It has been twisted, as Pace said, right, to mean a particular thing, and we've talked about this before, that's not actually like a faithful interpretation of that story.
Well, and speaking of interpretation and faithful interpretations or no, in verse 2 of Psalm 46, we read, "Therefore we will not fear, though the earth should change, though the mountains shake in the heart of the sea." Okay, so there is this quirky thing about Psalm 46 that I keep running into people who haven't heard of this, so I like to bring it up. But if you read the KJV, the King James Version of Psalm 46, if you count from the beginning of the psalm 46 words in, and then if you go down to the end of the psalm and you count backwards 46 words in, the first 46th word will be shake, and the 46th word from the end will be spear.
Oh.
The King James Version was published in the year 1611, which oddly enough was the year that Shakespeare was 46 years old. So the question that has been raised by people over the years about this is this a nod to Shakespeare by presumably King James, because who else would have the power to pull that off, in the psalm, because King James really liked Shakespeare, or because any number of other reasons. And the interesting thing that we've learned about King James in the years since that Bible being published is that one of the reasons why he was trying to get that Bible published was because he was trying to get the church off his back, because he was well known to not be particularly interested in women, and definitely had at least a couple of male lovers. Like many people who are royalty throughout history, we don't know that he was particularly loyal as those things go.
Yeah.
But was he maybe in love with Shakespeare? We don't know.
I love that. Thank you so much for bringing that up, because it makes me think of the Doctor Who episode, The Witchfinders, from season 11, one of the 13th Doctor episodes. And it has Alan Cumming play King James, and as this very queer, effeminate kind of take on King James, of course, coming from that. And it also ties back into what we were talking about, like the persecution of witches, and how King James might have been doing some of that as a way also of taking some of the heat off of him from the church for his own kind of queerness and stuff like that, and to try to show how faithful he was to the gospel and stuff. So it's another kind of interesting quirk of King James. And
then in verse 4 we read, "There is a river whose streams make glad the city of God, the holy habitation of the Most High." And this actually, like, the vision that was evoked for me in this verse was, it really feels like, again, in the Ember and the Ashes series, it feels like the River of Dusk that runs by Sher Jannat, which is the city of the jinn in the story, particularly that kind of scene before the scholars like come to that place and steal the knowledge of the jinn and then kill, destroy, imprison them. So like it's interesting to have like that juxtaposition between the tumult being one part of the story and the calm and the like gladness and almost meditativeness of the other place.
Our epistle reading for this episode is from Romans chapter 3, verses 19 through 28. Paul reminds us that humanity cannot bring ourselves into right relationship with God, but only God can make us right through faith.
So, one of the themes in this passage is the idea of righteousness or right relationship, which is kind of what the biblical term is referring to. And it reminded me of the book Simon and the Homo Sapiens Agenda, which is the book that the movie Love, Simon is based on, for those who have seen that one. And there's this sense that throughout the book, like, Simon is not in right relationship with most of his friends because he hasn't come out to them. And though there are complexities in coming out and not coming out, that not being in right relationship in that one aspect then makes the other parts of his relationship and the other ways that he's in relationship to his friends out of whack, and his family, because somebody finds out and is like threatening to out him, right? And so like that one aspect of being not in right relationship impacts the relationships, and like kind of has a domino effect of being out of right relationship with people.
Sure.
Yeah, a cascading sense of the things that they're called. And then as we dive into the verses, in verse 20 we read, "For no human will be justified in God's sight by deeds prescribed by the law, for through the law comes the knowledge of sin." So I was thinking about laws, and our podcast listeners already know that I have particular views about particular laws, right? And there's like some laws are just and some laws are not just, and laws are made by the powerful, and most frequently to keep people in power. But there's also like the sense of the laws that we make for ourselves, or like if you are an Enneagram 1, the laws that you make for everyone, whether or not you tell them that those are the laws that you have made. And I am in the middle of the book Monday's Not Coming, which is a young adult novel. And Claudia, it kind of jumps through different time periods, but the like before Claudia has created these different rules for her and for her best friend Monday to keep them safe as in their friendship, but also like from school bullies and from getting in trouble with teachers and that sort of thing. But then it, like, as the story progresses, like those laws that she has created, those rules that she has created, then don't open up the space for her to seek out or receive the help and the support that she needs in school, and don't let her have like a larger community and stuff. And so there's just the like complicatedness of how laws work, and when they are good and when they are bad, and when they are more complicated than the false binary of good or bad.
That when you first mentioned Monday's Not Coming, I was thinking of that movie we watched a while ago, and I thought that was what you're talking about first.
Yeah.
What is it? What Happened to Monday is what it's called.
Yeah.
This sci-fi kind of thriller movie with some horror elements in it too, but like because it sounded familiar enough, because in that movie they're trying to keep these 7 siblings safe with all these laws, because apparently in this dystopian future you can only have one child or something like that. So to keep people safe, there are 7 identical septuplets, and so each one was allowed one day of the week to be out and about, and then the rest they had to like follow these strict rules about how to be inside, so people don't know that there's multiple people living there. So that's what I thought you were talking about, but I was like, oh, this also kind of fits in with that weird movie that we watched.
Yeah, different character named Monday who also goes missing.
Yes. Yep.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then in verse 23, we read, "Since all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God." So no one is perfect, which is actually an ongoing Lutheran theme as well. Funny how that works out.
Way.
Everyone has flaws. And so back in the old days of the fan fiction internet community, and by old days, I'm referring to like late 90s, early 2000s. But also for a little while after that, there was this concept called a Mary Sue, which was usually an author self-insert character in a fan fiction where you created this perfect version of yourself. She was super powerful, she was gorgeous, all of the main characters fell in love with her.
Oh.
And that was what you wrote about in fan fiction, basically a fantasy of yourself. And more rarely, because in this time period, fandom was mostly a female space. You would also have Gary Stews, which were the male equivalent. This became a controversy in the early fandom days. Well, it wasn't early fandom days because fandom goes back to at least the 70s, if not, we're talking about like the Sherlock Holmes fandom in the 1800s. But in those earlier than nowadays, this became something of a controversy because there was this big conversation about how, all of those stories were actually not that great. Like, they were not fun to read. They were not that interesting. They were all very samey. But on the other hand, also, like, part of the reason why those stories existed was because women's dreams and fantasies about themselves were not being indulged by the produced content of Hollywood or books or anything like that. See the movie Jupiter Ascending, for example. And there was this conversation about how, yes, you should be allowed to dream. Yes, you should be allowed to have these fantasies for yourself by all means. But that doesn't mean you have to throw it at the rest of us at the rate of 100,000 words. And then also expect us to read it. And that worked out pretty interestingly. But the thing is that Mary Sues don't actually exist in the real world, because those people who you think might be one, who we all have people who we've met and we are convinced for a little while that they're perfect. But they actually do have flaws. You just haven't seen them yet.
Yeah.
And that also connects to Luther too, like the way like what we were talking about earlier, like the way we try to put people on a pedestal and are uncomfortable and don't want to talk about their flaws. But that's part of what makes them human. And especially for somebody like Luther, who taught us, that everyone is simultaneously a saint and a sinner. It's okay to say he wasn't perfect. So
our gospel reading for this episode is John chapter 8, verses 31 through 36. Jesus calls his followers to abide by his teachings, emphasizing that the truth will set them free from sin. So one of the themes in this passage is selective history, and kind of whose perspective are we learning history from? So in this passage, the people that Jesus is talking to, the Judeans, who are Jewish people, Jesus being also a Jewish person, are like, what? We're descendants of Abraham. We've never been slaves to anyone, which is not true. And Jewish people would not actually say that, right? There is an entire holiday, Passover, where it is declared, remember, you were slaves once in Egypt. And so there's like this, okay, what are we really, like, there's more going on to this than just what's at face value. But that reminded me of the controversy that has been happening around critical race theory, which is to say teaching history that actually happened, and the ways that different states, Iowa included, and different primarily Republicans have been trying to do more of a like Hunger Games books, capital approved history style of teaching, or as we talked about earlier, right? Not talking about the Christian anti-Semitism. And so like this passage, like in particular, has been used frequently to it as justification for anti-Semitism, right? To say, oh, look, the Jews, in quotes, right? The Jewish people here are saying that they've never been enslaved to anybody. They're enslaved now, and Jesus is like speaking ill of them. It's like, well, that's not actually what's happening, but that's just a like Christian anti-Semitism at work. Just like Martin Luther, just like Bonhoeffer, just like so many people.
Yeah, I have to get into my horror nerdness a little bit here, else I wouldn't be true to my horror nerds at church co-hosting self. But we talk about revisionist history as like, we hear about it in the news all the time as this kind of derogatory thing that a lot of people say about things, like exactly like you were talking about, Emily, like with things like critical race theory and stuff. It's like, we can't teach that. That's revisionist history, when actually it's teaching a more authentic history. And this happens in horror movies all the time. And it's such a repeating trope of when the people in charge of a town or a school or even of a camp, like in the Friday the 13th movies, will try to bury the harm of the bad stuff of their history to try to get past it and just pretend everything's all right. And then, of course, inevitably the killer comes back, resurfaces, and kills a bunch of people again. And it's like, if you just talked about it and just warned people what the dangers are of this particular thing and were frank about it, then people can make their own choices. But instead, you're like, by hiding it, you're only putting people in greater harm. And so I feel like that's kind of ties into this sense of like, why can't we just speak true to our history? Why? And just how that keeps coming up in horror movies. And right now we're working through the Friday the 13th horror franchise on Horror Nerds at Church, and we just entered into part 8, Jason Takes Manhattan. Yes, there are actually 12 entries in the Friday the 13th franchise. You would think they would come out with the 13th because of Friday the 13th, but they have not. There's all sorts of reasons there. You can listen to our podcast for more, but yeah, it keeps happening.
Yeah. And then in verse 32, we read, "And you will know the truth, and the truth will make you free." For example, if anyone had told Harry Potter about what a healthy teen and adult working relationship might actually look like, he could have had a much less troubled adolescence. Or at least known how screwed up it was at the time, which might have helped. You know?
Yeah.
I'm just saying.
And I looked at both verse 32 and verse 36. 36 says, "So if the Holy Child makes you free, you will be free indeed." And I immediately thought of the red pill in the Matrix, right? The red pill will set you free. It will set you free from this Matrix, that the red pill that Morpheus gives Neo, and then sets Neo free, detaches him from the Matrix and puts him into the real world, and starts the whole journey of discovering who he is and transforming into who he could be, you do.
So, Pace, any other thoughts on life, the universe, and everything?
So many, which is why you should come to our Horror Nerds at Church and listen to me ramble about my thoughts on life, the universe, and everything every Thursday, wherever you get your podcasts. And it's just as a warning, we do use a little bit more adult language in this podcast, but it's still a fun time. And like Emily and Kay were saying, we try to do a wide variety of horror movies, so it's not just scary stuff. We'll also do some more family friendly horror like Hocus Pocus and stuff like that. The other thing too is I'm in the works with a few people to try to bring some of my Queering the Reformation work to be some sort of webinar or something. Hopefully that will happen in the next few months. There'll be more information about that coming up, so definitely check that out if you're interested in any Luther stuff. If you want to read more Luther, I would say look up the annotated Luther, particularly volumes 1 and 2 are my two favorites. There's 6 volumes. It's the best translation of Luther in English, and it has a lot of annotations and stuff, so that way to help contextualize it and give you some background information, as opposed to probably what most people are familiar with, the American edition of Luther's works, which are just not accessible and use lots of things like exclusive language for God and mankind as opposed to humankind and stuff, whereas the annotated Luther is much better with that. So check that out as well.
Nice.
Great.
Just as a kind of post here, if you are interested in supporting Pace and Horror Nerds at Church or Nerds at Church, you can always support us through our Patreons. And Pace, what's the Patreon for Horror Nerds at Church for folks?
Patreon.com/Horror Nerds at Church. Very
awesome. Easy. And you can always ask Pace to come to your congregation, especially virtually, and do Reformation teaching and stuff too, because they are wonderful.
Definitely. Thank you so much. That's very sweet. I've spoken to congregations about Luther and Luther adjacent stuff and queer stuff, on everything from Luther's views on marriage to Luther and the Jews and stuff like that. So like really no topic is too off the wall for me. If it connects to Reformation, Luther, or horror nerd stuff, I mean, that's real.
Right. Any of that. Well, thanks for joining us, Pace, and thanks for joining us, listeners. Catch us next time when we'll discuss nerdery connections to the scripture readings for All Saints' Day with our special guest, Sister Colleen O'Toole. This podcast has been produced by us, Emily Ewing, and Kay Roloff. For more fun, check us out on Twitter and Facebook at NERDSATCHURCH, Nerds at Church, or contact us at nerdsatchurch@gmail.com.
Also, if you like what you've heard, rate us or leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Facebook, or wherever you catch your podcasts. If you want access to our full guest episodes and interviews, support us on Patreon at patreon.com/nerdsatchurch. We hope Patreon can help us get our episodes transcribed for those who need or prefer that. Though, if you want to help us with the transcripts, let us know via email or social media. As the ancient Christians said,
Pax vobiscum.